Welcome back, everyone. Our next panel is titled Business, Sport, and Human Rights, and it explores the complex intersections between global sport, corporate power, and human rights. As the sports industry grows into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, from mega events and sponsorship deals to apparel production and media rights, the role of business in shaping ethical standards and labor conditions across the sector is increasingly under scrutiny. With growing pressure on companies and sports organizations to respect human rights and avoid complicity and abuse, panelists will examine emerging frameworks, real-world case studies, and strategies for ensuring ethical practice in deeply commercialized global sports environments. I'd like to introduce our moderator for this panel, Dr. Rachel Chambers. Rachel is an assistant professor of business law at the University of Connecticut School of Business and director of the Business and Human Rights Initiative. Dr. Chambers' research centers on corporate accountability mechanisms, and she has worked as a consultant for organizations including the UN Global Compact and Amnesty International. Please join me in welcoming Rachel.
Thank you, Erica, and welcome to the panel on sport, business, and human rights. It's a real pleasure to introduce the panelists today, and that's what I will do first before I invite them to give you some remarks. So to my right is Daniela Heerdt. She's a researcher from T.M.C. Asser Institute in the Netherlands, and she's head of education and research at the Center for Sport and Human Rights. To her right is Suzanne McKenzie, founder and CEO of Able Made, and a lot more, as she'll tell you. To her right, Ginous Alford, independent scholar and consultant. And then on the end, Kyle Muncy from UConn, Director of Brand Partnerships and Trademark Management here. So I'm going to invite each of them to make some introductory remarks. I've got a question, a prompt for them. Once they've spoken, I'm going to invite you all to bring your questions forth. There are mics that will be shared around the room. We very much encourage a participatory session. So to kick off, Daniela, if I may, in an era where global audiences and markets demand both performance and principles, how should business and sports organizations balance commercial success with a commitment to human rights? Thanks, Daniela.
Thank you, Rachel, and thanks to the organizers for having us and having me here. Before I answer, I think I just want to say, maybe my fellow panelists agree, this is going to be a bit of a pivot compared to what we just heard, the very impactful story, powerful story, to, I would say, a bit more conceptual, perhaps theoretical from my part, but then of course also with very concrete case studies from the others. But yeah, just wanted to make that remark. And to get to your question, Rachel, I actually don't agree with the question, how it's phrased. And that's because I don't think at all it should be a balancing act. I don't think human rights should come at the expense of commercial interests. Instead, I think there is a way that we can pursue commercial interests in a way that there are no negative impacts on human rights, or where there still are, we find a way to actually address those and also provide remedy for these negative impacts. And I think that's in particularly, especially true for sports for various reasons. One is, I think, because we've heard so often now, yesterday and also the first day of the conference, how unique sport is, the special status and position it has in our society, and how much good it can bring, and how, it brings people together in ways that little else can do in our society. But also, I think we can raise that expectation to sports, because, and that's something that was mentioned yesterday in the panel on sports washing, for the longest time, sport has been left to pretty much regulate itself. And my experience is much more on the European model of sport. I want to mention that as a disclaimer. But in any case, what we see is that, sport is often dealt with as this specific thing that can regulate itself, and there's little to almost no intervention from any sort of state authority or other authority. So this concept of sport autonomy is a thing. And as we know, it does bring about quite some challenges and leads to harm as well, especially in the context of mega sporting events, but also day-to-day sports. I don't want to go into these examples again because we've heard a lot in the last couple of days. But I want to share what I think is the good news. And that is that we also have frameworks and tools and concepts to address that and to help sports actually manage to not put commercial interests at the cost of human rights. And that is especially the framework that was mentioned yesterday by Minky, the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. And I want to just spend a bit more time talking about them because I think they are it's quite a powerful framework if used correctly and genuinely by actors. And those of you that are familiar with the business and human rights debate, they will know all about it, but some might not. So I'm just going to quickly go into that. So this framework has been developed on the United Nations level with the goal actually to regulate business behavior after this realization that, we've seen a lot of damage, harm on human rights being done by businesses, but nobody is holding them to account. And so for a while, there were negotiations led by a man named John Ruggie. And they came up with these UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, adopted in 2011, so quite a while back by now. And they rest on 3 pillars. The first pillar is the state duty to protect, respect, and fulfill human rights. So reminding all the governments and states, you are the key duty bearers here. The second one is the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. So that's kind of the novelty that was introduced by these UN Guiding Principles. And that's about how businesses should, work with human rights. And the third one is access to remedy for the rights holders. So when harm has happened, that there needs to be pathways to remedy. In addition to these 3 pillars, and especially within this second pillar, there's also this human rights due diligence tool or process that was also mentioned yesterday. And I think that is really key to kind of unpack and understand what that actually means and how organizations can use that to understand their human rights responsibilities and act accordingly. And essentially, human rights due diligence is a kind of risk management tool, you can say, that helps organizations to first identify and assess the adverse human rights impacts they have. Secondly, identify or take measures then to address these impacts that can be seizing or mitigating, preventing. Then thirdly, tracking the effectiveness of the measures that they have implemented. And finally, communicating also about what they have done, what they've identified as the adverse impacts, what measures they took, and how effective all that was. There are 3 more elements to these UN Guiding Principles that I want to mention. Really important is to realize when we talk about identifying and assessing risks, it's not the risk to the organization. It's not about reputational risks or any other kind of risk that the organization faces. It's the risk to the people, to the rights holders. So that's central. The second one is, if we talk about these adverse impacts, the UN Guiding Principles actually give us quite a good overview of what these different scenarios could be that an organization is involved in adverse impacts. So you can think about then if an organization is directly causing such an impact, or an organization is contributing to a negative impact, or an organization is directly linked to such an impact. And depending on the level of involvement, there are also different types of expectations and responsibilities then attached to that. And finally, the final, I think, core element of this framework is this idea of stakeholder engagement. Which is really running throughout the entire human rights due diligence process and connects very nicely with what we've heard in the last couple of days about how those that are affected by sports in a positive and negative way need to have a seat at the table. They need to be involved. They need to be included. Now, it's a framework developed for business. It found its way into sport. You wonder why, you wonder how. So I'll briefly go into that. So one side of the answer is, I think, indeed, this whole mega sporting event business. So when the principles were adopted, at the same time, as was mentioned yesterday, we became much more aware about the human rights risks and impacts of these events. So that was a good framework also to unpack what are the different responsibilities of the different corporate actors involved, right? The sponsors, the broadcasters, all the contractors, basically. The other side of that is that in 2015, as many of you might know, FIFA was again in quite a crisis. And as part of their reactions to the crisis, they actually hired John Ruggie, so the author of these guidelines, to help them understand what could these guidelines mean for us? What could these principles mean for us as an organization? Because as you might know, these federations, sports organizations, they're not corporate actors. They're not registered as companies. Clubs often have that element, but federations, sports bodies, they don't. They're usually associations. But nevertheless, FIFA took that step, and the result was a report with a bunch of recommendations, which some of them were followed by FIFA, including FIFA adopted a provision in their statutes to commit to respecting human rights. They adopted a human rights policy, among other things. And that had quite an impact in the world of sport, in the sense that other sport actors started to kind of follow that path. We had in 2017 already, not just FIFA, but also the IOC and also UEFA, changing their bidding and hosting regulations for their big events, for their big tournaments, to include human rights criteria. And we see, since I think 2024, the first events actually being hosted with these requirements in place. So it's all still kind of new, and evaluations are still happening of how effective all that is. But we also saw lots of other sport bodies, international federations, but also national sport bodies making commitments to human rights in their statutes or adopting human rights policies. And a lot of them with explicit reference to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And I just want to stress again this basic idea of these principles, right? So it's really that the idea that if businesses want to maintain their social license to operate, we can expect from them to take human rights into account, to respect human rights in all their operations and activities. And that's the expectation we are raising to sports. It's not about making sport responsible for all the harm that's going on, for all the terrible things that are happening in a host city, for example, but it's really about helping sports understand where can we have positive impacts and seizing these opportunities to protect, respect human rights, and where do we have negative impacts to help sports understand how to address those and how to react to those. And in the last couple of seconds that I have, I just quickly wanted to add some remarks on this idea of access to remedy, because that's where my work focuses on a lot. And I think we've talked about it a lot yesterday, that we need to help athletes and others potentially impacted to understand what their rights actually are. But we also need to help them understand how they can actually claim these rights. Where can they go? What can they do about it? And there we see that, especially in sports, the mechanisms for dealing with human rights cases are not adequate. And that has various reasons. Missing expertise for sports-specific mechanisms, so those that are internal in sports, not having the sufficient expertise. Some of the rights holders actually lacking standing to access these mechanisms. And I think what we also shouldn't forget is then if we look at external mechanisms, so just normal, ordinary courts, a lot of the sports bodies have clauses in place that actually prohibit recourse to ordinary courts, civil, criminal courts. But I think it's really important to think about that step, that remedy, because it's linked to the notions of justice and accountability. And if we think about change, how we bring about change, I think working towards closing the accountability gap is certainly one, hopefully, efficient way to go about that. And I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for providing us with that really strong background and helping us to frame our conversation here. I'm going to turn next to Ginous. I know that you want to connect to some of the points that Daniela has raised and bring up some new ones. So over to you. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Daniela, for doing all of the heavy lifting. Special thanks to Dr. Waller and Dr. LaPlante. It's been, as the person who hosted the inaugural Sporting Chance Forum on Human Rights at the U.S. State Department in 2016, I know what fantastic and important work you've done. And I also want to say thank you to Professor Shireen Heerdt and to my business and human rights professor going way back, Liz Umlas, for connecting me to the great team at the Dodd Center and the Gladstein Institute. And good morning, everybody. I know that this is the panel that is expressly dedicated to business in this summit, so I promise to keep my remarks, to that. And I will just quickly lead in by telling you that before I came into this intersection of business and human rights and sport, my orientation around sport was kind of forged in the great state of Alabama, where we often had an adage that SEC football on Saturday was as important as church on Sunday. And this was in the Bible Belt. So I grew up knowing that sport could sometimes act as religion. My Iranian-American mother, engineering major at Auburn University, would often use, her Auburn kind of fandom to bridge divides, to bridge differences in the classroom, in the workplace, in the community. So I also knew from a young age that sport could be kind of a cultural diplomacy. And I played the other football. I played soccer myself, which was, and eventually, I wanted to play in the Women's United Soccer Association, which actually folded in my junior year of university. So my dreams of being a professional footballer were kind of dashed, but I pivoted into sports journalism, and all of that led me kind of here today. So I really have experienced many of these, the best of what sport can be, but it was never very hard for me to see that sport can also be these other things, and some of it can be the worst of what people and countries and cultures can be. Nationalist, partisan, divided, distracted, corrupt, greedy. So if you were here yesterday, I think a lot of this has already been pretty well established. It's undisputed that sport is this multifaceted paradox. And so no one is here to claim that it's, only good, only bad, but we're definitely, I think, here to kind of say that it can't just be neutral. Also, what Daniela did a good job just lining out is that it's governed paradoxically. And that's important for anyone who's, a student for business and law. You need to understand that it is regulated, commercially operated, politically and legally insulated by sui generis organizations. And I had to go to law school for a little while to understand what sui generis meant and why that can be tricky. But this is the conundrum for businesses that want to operate in this industry and don't want to be connected to harms that can happen in the value chain. So no one denies that there isn't this powerful draw for investors and suppliers and brands and broadcasters and other commercial actors. Just some quick numbers. The sports market is actually now valued at approximately $2.65 trillion if you include sport participation, product, and fan engagement. And even if you just look at the narrower valuation of just the traditional commercial activities around media and events, it's projected to grow from some $400 billion today to about $600 billion by 2030, give or take probably a few hundred millions. The FIFA Men's World Cup next year is going to generate tens of billions of dollars in revenue. The 2028 LA Olympics will be one of the most commercially lucrative in history. So just remember, and this is what I heard the kind of sports management professor say earlier, that where there is value creation, you also have to talk about where there can be value extraction. And many industries, sport included, can externalize those costs. And we're talking today about how many of those costs are human. So we see workers, local residents, journalists, fans, and especially athletes, the ones who generate the spectacle itself, that bear risks that they did not choose and harms that they did not design. So thank you for Dr. Heerdt, because she talked about how these asymmetries are what the UNGPs, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, were created to deal with. And that framework really clarified that no sector is exempt from these responsibilities, not even sport, no exceptions. So we have been looking at the application of the UNGPs for about 10 years. And as Daniela was saying, that the maybe the outcome can be a mixed bag, but what we're also seeing is that it's traveling in the right direction. So I wanted to go into this kind of Rorschach test of athlete rights, which is really where you can say, are sports bodies and businesses that operate in sport really understanding what it means to reckon with the fact that there is no balancing act between principle and your performance? Athletes have human rights. So if you can kind of stand on the right ground of recognizing the international human rights of athletes, then you are really moving far and fast and in the right direction. So it's difficult to speak to businesses about this. We talked yesterday about many of the stereotypes around athletes, the spoiled millionaires, the dumb jocks. You can think about other toxic stereotypes thrown around about athletes on campuses. Just remember that this is the product of a system, and it's a system that the athletes are not the ones who created themselves. So we have to look at who benefits from that system, which is a classic case of follow the money, and not just the money that goes to the top earning athletes. That's not where the money flows first. It's not where it flows the fastest. And so it's not where the buck stops. So it's easy to first scrutinize the athletes. They're the most visible, but that actually makes them the most vulnerable. This is a system that's plagued with gambling, systemic doping, corruption, racism, sexism, favoritism, and a culture of toxic masculinity and interpersonal violence that yesterday we heard features some of the worst forms of abuse. We heard from Drs. Smith and Carlos on Wednesday about what they experienced, and they spoke very beautifully about just the hate that they want to see sport deal with for sport to lift, but also that they experienced in sport itself. So let's talk about what the first step is before my time runs out. This is taking that system of human rights due diligence that Dr. Heerdt talked about and applying it to athlete relations. So not only in mega event bidding and supply chain audits, but making sure that every sport federation, club, league, sponsor, brand, university has an athlete rights policy, and that policy is grounded in international human rights and labor standards, not just the rights we want them to have, the rights that they inherently have. This policy should include fundamental rights to freedom of expression and opinion, the fundamental freedom of association and peaceful assembly. One example of this is Adidas, which has a human rights defender policy in which they expressly recognize that athletes who speak out deserve protections against retaliation and reprisals. And I personally think that if you're a student of law or business today, this is a career-shaping frontier if you're interested in sport. If you feel this is difficult to frame within ideas that you've grown up with about athletes and the identity of an athlete, try to retrain your mind that when you think about the archetype of an athlete, you discipline yourself not to first not think about LeBron and Messi and Serena Williams or Paige Beckers. Think about smaller names or athletes whose names you might not even know, who could be professionals, who could be athletes on campus. Think about their families. Think about who might rely on them for income, right now, or when their sport career may end in 1 year, 5 years, or 10 years if they're the lucky ones. So I'll end with where I started. Sport is culture with big commercial coattails. And we talk about it a lot as one of humanity's most universal languages, which if you study language, that's actually one of the oldest technologies. So, who knew? Sport is actually one of the oldest technologies in the world. The UN Special Rapporteur for Cultural Rights devoted her 2024 thematic report to the question of sport. If you go to the exhibit outside in the hallway, you'll see quotes from some of her recommendations. And she recognized the human right of every person, particularly every athlete, but not just athletes, to participate in sport as part of their right to participate in cultural life. In her report, she calls for the adoption of a human rights-based approach to sport, including the responsibility of those doing the business of sport to respect human rights. I won't summarize too much because I think, I really would recommend that you go and read it. And in fact, I wish Tommy Smith and John Carlos and Peter Norman, who were on that podium in 1968, had this report to wave in the air at those who sought to punish them for those 9 seconds during the medal ceremony. I wish they had an athlete rights policy within the IOC, within their National Olympic committees, within those sponsors that made their uniforms that they were wearing up on the podium. I wish that the athlete policies in 2025 fully upheld the human rights of athletes. And I'll just end with saying that I want every athlete to know there is global recognition now that athletes who champion human rights for themselves and others are human rights defenders, and that there are global guidelines and mechanisms for supporting and protecting them if they face attacks. And so businesses that want to do due diligence should use these reports, similar impact assessments, to talk to athletes, understand what those salient risks are, and then they'll be able to know that they have aligned performance and principle when they activate around this multi-trillion-dollar, culturally important industry. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I'm going to move to you, Suzanne. So take it away. Thank you so much.
First, I wanted to start by saying thank you to UConn for having this important summit. I know in political times right now, some of these conversations are hard to have, especially on an academic campus. So I really wanted to recognize UConn for that. And also, I don't think he's here, but Richard Holland, who introduced me to this opportunity and also helped with the graphics that you see as a graphic designer myself. I wanted to give him a shout out because I think it's beautiful and very impactful. I'm going to be inviting you on a journey with me as an entrepreneur and a business builder to highlight some human rights and sports related topics that I'm seeing in real time. And I wanted to start by asking a question by show of hands. How many of you have had Ben & Jerry's ice cream? Okay. I think my house was like one of the most popular ones in the block because my dad did refrigeration projects for Ben & Jerry's when I was growing up. So it was literally my first taste of how business could combine amazing product first and foremost, really cool branding, and then values. So that really hit hard with me. And then as a 3-sport athlete growing up in Maine, who's from Maine? Any Maine? Yeah, Maniacs in the back, yes. I learned things on and off the court. I started in 2nd grade and, learned things, about discipline, determination, dedication, teamwork, passion. But I also learned about action, right? So I learned that if you wanted to get better, you had to go out and practice late at night or early in the morning before you went to school. If you wanted to come back after a loss, you'd have to work with your teammates and strategize and work really hard to do a comeback. And not only has that informed my adulthood, but it's also informed how I approach business. You have to take action. And I think it's so important to have the grounding of policy and understanding the history of where things are coming from and where to frame it. And I think the next most important step is actually doing something about it, even though it might be messy and not be all the way correct. You have to start, right? So I started my career in graphic design. As I mentioned, I'm a graphic design by trade and double majored in advertising in Boston. So I started my career at Arnold Worldwide in their heyday when they were one of the hottest ad agencies in the country, and worked on accounts like ESPN and Timberland and Cars, Cruise Banks, Titleist, the golf brand, where I had to ask myself, what is a driver? Because I had no idea. So I had to do a lot of catch-up work and learn things on the sporting side. From there, I've worked with a big branding agency called IDEO, who does amazing global work in medical devices and so many other categories, Apple, and then started working at another consultancy firm and worked on Sprint, American Express, and new business accounts. But I really just held that Ben & Jerry's inspiration. I've always done nonprofit work on the side, even when working at big global brands. But, also kind of felt like those brands I was touching for the most part were not really paying off the values values-driven work that I wanted to see, the human rights works that I wanted to see. So I actually set off to build my own practice to work exclusively with those kinds of businesses, ones that cared about people, planet, and cared about a triple bottom line, people, planet, and profit, not just profit. I had a really big life change about 4 weeks after I sought out to start my own business, leaving my full-time cushy job. When I lost my husband in sudden cardiac arrest on a soccer field. He was only 32. He was only 32 at the time and was a first-generation immigrant from Jamaica. He came over to the States when he was just 16 and got comfortable in a new country and culture through the sport and wanted to pay that forward. So he became the first in his family to get his master's degree. He became a local guidance counselor in Newton, Massachusetts, and was the boys' varsity soccer coach. But what was most beautiful about him is that he did a lot of outreach to inner city youth in Boston and did that through the sport of soccer. So he'd pick up kids from Dorchester and Roxbury and bring them to practice when they didn't have a guardian to drive them. He just really connected with city youth with his humor, with his dance skills, and just charisma and heart. And I quite immediately started the UConn McKenzie Breakaway Foundation literally to get myself out of bed in the morning after that devastation. And my idea was to tackle human rights with some creativity. And what we do is we provide very affordable soccer camps and clinics for city youth. And we also we kind of sneak in the hour of education to combine wellness and well-being. So hands-only CPR and AD awareness, of course, but also suicide prevention, financial literacy, injury prevention, sports recovery, so that they're learning things that they can build a life off of wellness and well-being, both on and off the court, field rather. We're now in 3 markets. We're 16 years old, going on 17 next year. So shout out to my team, who's amazing in making that happen. And we don't skimp on the quality and the quality of what we're doing because of the price. I heard someone talk earlier in the summit about how unaffordable AAU is and how unaffordable, youth sports is in this country and beyond. And we're kind of pushing back on that BS because we think that it's a human right to have access to sports because you learn so much. It should not be based on how much you can spend. And we've had Christine Lilly, we've had Barcelona come over twice. We work with all of the major sports leagues in every single market that we're in. In Boston, we work with the Kraft Group and New England Revolution. We just started with the NWSL Boston Legacy team. In Hartford, we work with the USL team, Hartford Athletic, who's introducing a women's team, which we're really excited about. And then in New York City, we're working with NYC FC and Brooklyn FC. So we're partnering with Puma, we're partnering with Capital One, and it's been really interesting to see that human rights part and conversation come with these big global brands who are partnering with us on content and seeing what's sort of driving them to work with us. It's, the community that we've built, but it's also, to be honest, from a business perspective, thousands of kids that we're reaching in every single market. Obviously, they want to have access to that too, but I understand what their business strategy and goals are, and they understand that I want to make an impact, so it works. And then I will also just address that we have also started a fashion brand that's growing very quickly. It's soccer inspired. It's called Able Made. And we're not just, creating another fashion brand. We're taking our responsibility with us. And we're responsibly made. We're using sustainable fabrics and trims. And we're also giving some sale proceeds back to the foundation that we've built. So there's a really deep connection between, the business side and the human rights and impact side. We've worked with Burberry. We've worked with, a lot of different big brands. We just signed an NDA with one of the biggest soccer clubs in the world. But I will say that, we describe Able Made as if you could imagine sporty Nike having a baby with responsible Patagonia. And if that baby's born, they have a sporty aunt named Gucci, or a fashionable aunt named Gucci. So it's really this intersection of sport, responsibility, and higher, not athleisure. Athleisure is a dirty word around Able Made. It's more like ready to wear. So it's like, you're not going to see a soccer jersey. You're going to see maybe like a cat suit or a quilted bomber jacket. So it's a little bit more like sophisticated sport, look. But in that journey, like, we're so particular about the factories that we choose, about the fabrics that we use, so that we're not just like a business that is giving proceeds back to this nonprofit, but in our operational goals and how we work as a business really is addressing human rights. All of our workers get paid fairly. They're in safe work environments. We're so sticklers. There's got certifications. There's Blue Sign. There's a bunch of standards that we really prioritize in terms of choosing our partners. We're worn across the Premier League, La Liga, Serie A, MLS, NWSL, but also the NBA. The W just asked us to do a collaboration. We have investors from Nike and Adidas, former chairman for the Premier League. It's been incredible, like the last 24 months. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but how I'm seeing the intersection of sport and human rights live time, right? From not only building my business, but partnering with really big businesses and clubs, not only now in soccer, but basketball, pro basketball and beyond. It's been pretty remarkable, but there's still not a prioritization on impact from what I see. Like, youth sports is still very expensive, and there's not this big pushback just yet. Everyone's still, playing in AAU. Everyone's still playing in club. Also in fashion, it's the third most polluting industry in the world. I'm not seeing a very big pushback. There's like Sheen hauls on IG. There's so much going on that does not incorporate or discuss or address human rights. So what we're doing is pushing back and inspiring others on the business level to get involved with us from an impact standpoint. And I can just tell you, hands down, in every single business deal we've done, it's because people like the content and the style and the quality, but they also find it as a way that they could pay us their ESG strategy. So whether it's authentic or not, I'm not as concerned, but I just want to impress upon big business and consumers that you can do things in a really cool, stylish way and then bring people along on the ride with you. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. You've really brought us down to the level of the grassroots, to your business, to your nonprofit. And now I'll turn it over to Kyle to speak from the university perspective, I think tying in some of your work on sourcing of our products, but also all that you do. So thanks, Kyle.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Rachel, and fellow panelists, and Jim and Erica. I'm a firm believer you're known by the company you keep, and I'm incredibly humbled to be asked to participate in this panel and the panel after lunch. I hope you can all stay and join. We've got some fantastic former UConn athletes that I think will really tie a bow around these couple days of great conversation. As you probably have seen if you've walked the hallways, the history of our activism and engagement in this space that relates to the work of my office dates back to the late 90s and early 2000s, with stories of Nike and sweatshop labor causing students to demand more from universities all around this country. We were one of the earliest adopters of a comprehensive licensee code of conduct, instituted a university vendor code of conduct through the work of the President's Committee on Corporate Social Responsibility. That's a standing committee here on campus that's been in existence for 20 plus years and has bridged the administration of 5 different presidents here at this institution. Today, UConn is universally regarded as the standard for institutional and industry-wide engagement in the area of licensed merchandise supply chain oversight, management. We work proactively with students, faculty, staff, external constituents, and are proud to protect over 1 million workers at 3,500 factories in 48 countries around the world. Not every university is doing that work, But every university is benefiting from that work. We all share the same licensees. We all share the same partners. The pro leagues care very little about that. But what I will tell you, and I like to relay this story because it pumps our tires, but also shows just how important the work is, and that a high tide does raise all ships. In the pro leagues, I have a colleague that worked at Major League Baseball for many, many years. And we were talking about our work with the WRC, with the FLA, and why the pro leagues have a hesitancy to get involved at that particular level. And he looked at me and he said, well, because you do it. We have the same partners. When a partner comes to Major League Baseball and says, we would like to be licensed, we would like to create New York Yankees product, Boston Red Sox product, the first thing we ask them, are you licensed in college? Because if they are, then we know that they're monitoring their supply chain. So again, I think, these are multi-trillion-dollar industries, the NFL, Major League Baseball, NHL, NBA, they follow our lead in this space. Their supply chains are safe because our supply chain is safe because we're doing the work to make sure that it's safe. So we're proud of the fact that our place in this area of expertise is grounded in our mission of our institution, not simply because there are protests or that we're reacting to issues around the world. We're fortunate to have a faculty and student base made up of incredibly serious thinkers around these issues that impact our university and universities all around the country every day. Philosophically, as we talk about performance and principles, partnership is at the root of that. Partnership allows for collaboration. It allows for influence. It allows and directs change. No partnership is perfect. No partner is perfect. No factory is perfect. Mistakes will happen. Partnership and deep collaboration allow for influence and allow for us to affect change in those particular spaces. We have 500 plus partners associated across various levels of this institution in one way or the other. We also have revenue challenges unlike any other time in our history at this institution. Yes, it's important to have a strict selection and vetting process for how you pick your partners, for who you partner with, how you partner with them. But at the end of the day, it's that push and pull. You have the instances, for instance, for a company that's creating merchandise in Indonesia. They have a team that will go and visit factories to try to find the right factory. That the buying team will have a reason that factory is attractive to them. It could be price, it could be turnaround time, but the social responsibility team is going to be looking at completely different reasons that factory is good or bad as a partner for that company. And the important piece of it, and ties into what we do here at the university, no matter who our partner is, we know that at the highest levels of this institution, we have the support to be able to say, this partnership is not worth the risk. And so we do that every day in our office, much more deeply from our 230 to 240 licensed merchandise partners. But that type of vetting process carries through to bigger partners, not just apparel partners like Nike or partners like Coca-Cola or partners like Barnes & Noble. So it's very important to make sure that you are as collaborative and that our partners understand, exactly what we are about and what our mission is about. The challenge today is that students are focused on so many different things. Okay. I can't tell you the last time I had a student come in my office and complain about where we're sourcing our licensed merchandise or a partner that we have in the licensed merchandise space. And when I took over in this particular role in 2011, that was happening on a regular basis, monthly, yearly. Today it's about climate, it's about sustainability, it's about local labor challenges. Students on this campus and students all around the country are far more focused on the workers in their supply chain on their particular campus. Sorry, I'm keeping a timer because I'm a talker. So, when you are focused as a student, the activism on campus is looking to protect the graduate assistants on their campuses and other workers on their campuses, and maybe not as focused on those 1 million workers in 48 countries around the world. Athletes today have different voices, and as you all know, they all have different bank accounts. 11 years ago, we won the men's and women's national championship in 2014 here at UConn. It's the second time that we've won both championships in the same year. And in 2014, after the men won the championship, on the court with the NCAA championship trophy in his hand, Shabazz Napier famously said that he went to bed hungry some nights during the run to the national title because NCAA rules and regulations did not allow for schools to feed their student athletes to the level that a growing young man or woman might need to be fed. You could give someone a bagel for breakfast, but NCAA rules said you couldn't give them cream cheese to go along with it, right? So Shabazz Napier takes the microphone on the floor at the Final Four and affects change. Today, Shabazz Napier would be getting paid $2.5 million to play basketball at UConn. Would he be complaining about bagels? Would he be complaining about the bagels for the student athletes that aren't getting paid $2 million on their campus? I have hope, and certainly we're fortunate. We have good examples of student athletes that will use that pulpit for good, making sure that they're advocating. I wish LeBron James and Serena Williams and others that are partnered with our great partner, Nike, would work with us to make sure that we are educating the public about the work that's going on in supply chains all around the world. Because if you Google Nike in sweatshops, you still get hits on articles from the 1990s because they're so prevalent. It's such a negative reputation that, quite frankly, isn't always warranted on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's important for folks to understand the work that happens on this campus every day. And we're certainly thrilled that everybody today, the last couple of days, this type of event, this doesn't happen at other institutions around the country. We're proud to carry the mantle, and we look forward to working with you and any of you on things like this over the coming years.
Thanks so much, Kyle, and thanks everyone for really setting up this conversation from your different perspectives. I'm going to open the floor up in a moment, but I did want to follow up with a couple of quick questions. So just starting with you, Daniela, since you went first, you talked about your work regarding access to remedy, and I think that would be interesting for us to learn a little bit more about, what exactly you do, how access to remedy is put in place in the circumstances that you are involved.
Sure, yeah. As a researcher, my work is a bit more on the, conceptual, theoretical side of things, in the sense that because this whole idea of applying the UN guiding principles to sports, and especially this third pillar of access to remedy, is still fairly new. It involves a lot of mapping what is out there, understanding where are the gaps, where do things fall short. And I already sketched a little bit what we see as the current landscape of sport and human rights remedy mechanisms. There are a lot of gaps, there are a lot of obstacles that need to be overcome by rights holders. And one kind of specific focus focus I've had recently was, or in recent years and months, is looking at grievance mechanisms for mega sporting events. So, as I mentioned, in 2017, when these kind of add-ons to the existing host city contracts, hosting agreements were made, where human rights requirements were included. Some of them also, include this idea of having a grievance mechanism attached to a mega sporting event, where people that have been harmed or have experienced some sort of risk around or linked to the event can go and complain. And we've seen, a couple of events that have worked with these mechanisms in place. I think to again maybe highlight FIFA's work here, they installed a online complaint mechanism already for the Qatar World Cup. And there, what was quite a fascinating experience is that we had a team of human rights volunteers actually on the ground during the World Cup that were kind of observing, but also directly interacting with some of the fans, but also the workers at the different stadiums and also the fan zones to kind of see what is their experience. Have they experienced some sort of harm? And when that was the case, to highlight and to raise awareness about that mechanism where they could complain. And our task as like team leaders of these volunteers was that we were looking at the complaints that were coming in and trying to kind of see a bit of what are kind of structural issues that could be addressed on the spot. Because, I mean, let's face it, we all know at that point when the Qatar World Cup was happening, most of the very grave, serious violations have happened and they are still not addressed today, right? So that was way more about things like accessibility issues, but also at the security gates, for instance, having fans trying to enter with rainbow hats or rainbow socks and these kind of things, or other kind of ways where fans tried to protest and that wasn't allowed. So just engaging with like these kind of mechanisms, understanding how are event owners, how are other actors involved trying to live up to that expectation and building these grievance mechanisms. How are they operating? We do see lots of reliance on external like law firms that say they have expertise also, for instance, in trauma-informed approaches to handling cases. So outsourcing that the reality is there is no guideline on how, what is the best practice for such mechanisms for these events. But that's what we're trying to do, to understand, what should that look like. And maybe as a final remark, what I observe a lot in my work is that, and it always surprises me, there's so much out there on general business and human rights that sports can learn from. But, sports likes to do things on their own and likes to stick to themselves and think we have to do and invent it all ourselves. And that's what I find really frustrating, because there's so much that they can learn from by just looking at how other sectors and industries are doing that. Just trying to bridge that gap. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Ginous, I know you talked about the rights of athletes in terms, on a variety of different levels. You didn't really talk about the remedy piece there. How do they, for example, grievance mechanisms Daniela just spoke about, or others. So if you could speak to that, and also if you have any response to Kyle's comments around athletes, here at UConn or beyond. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm glad you mentioned Kyle's remarks, because I wanted to pick up on something that you said that before you mentioned the athletes. It was the work that you've done to set up a very comprehensive system to vet and to ensure that you're embedding all of your values into your relationships with your vendors. And I know this because coming here for some of the cost reimbursements, I actually got to register through the vendor system, and I am one of these people who does read the terms and conditions when I click on things. And I was really impressed by how it wasn't just kind of a check the box sort of minimum standards. This was a pretty textbook study of what you would want to see institutions, companies do when they're setting up this relationship, both at the beginning and then as you read through, the expectations that flow both ways. And so it brings me to the athletes. This is one of the things that athletes are sometimes compelled to do, and we all know this from signing up for online platform accounts, right? Try saying no to the terms and conditions. You're not going to be able to use it. And we rely so much on these technologies and tools to go about our everyday business. So, we know a lot about what it means to consent to something and then to really consent to it. And this is one of the areas where athletes are really at a disadvantage. There's an imbalance of power. And if they want to participate in sport, then the ones who hold that power really get to set the conditions about their participation, unless they have figured out some way to amass power and leverage to negotiate the terms of those conditions. And I think this is one area where your observations about kind of the modern athlete, the sort of the youth these days, what we see in modern society, and that I think is pretty timeless, or it's across generations, that we are much more fragmented, much more disconnected, much more separated, divided from both our local communities and our global communities, rather than it being kind of this shrinking glocal world, global and local. It's almost like it's become a bit of a hollow, individualistic world. And so this is where, values are the reparations for that. It's how we reconnect to ourselves, reconnect to our neighbors, reconnect to our humanity and our fellow humans. And athletes we've seen, examples, been wonderful leaders in that space. And then they have suffered high consequences and costs sometimes for those actions. And that made an example out of them of this is what happens to you if you stick your neck above the parapet, And that's why I was, really keen to talk about these standards, these guidelines for human rights defenders. Because if you do something like that, through your actions, you have actually become a defender of human rights, a champion of human rights for yourself and for others. And there is a duty of care for everyone, especially in the human rights community, but actually everyone, the state, companies, everyone you have these relationships with, to rally around you. And you can expect that. And that's where, if we don't follow through with that loyalty to each other, then those betrayals actually end up setting us all backwards. And so I think that can happen collectively too, when we need the power of the people and those voices to maintain something, because there is a lot of work that goes into that. There's a lot of political capital. There's a lot of organizational investment in maintaining those systems. And when people are doing their cost-benefit analysis, their return on investment, whether it's an individual athlete or whether it's a university, they're starting to think of themselves, well, what happens if I don't do it? And if I can just, to the remedy point, sometimes there's remedy in being able to sue the bastards if it doesn't work, right? But that's not the only definition of remedy. Sometimes it's an apology. Sometimes it's knowing that things will change and be better going forward, that the same harm you experienced won't happen to someone else. So I was also really interested to hear you talk about the work that you do has become this infrastructure that everyone else is kind of riding your coattails, which is great. I'm happy to know that, because in terms of an outcome, that's very good. But it also means that, you're a leader and you have all the laggards that are kind of sitting behind you. And if we really expect everyone to step up and be those leaders, then it drives it forward. And that's remedy too.
Thank you so much. Suzanne, I feel like, pulling off what Ginous just said about, the global and the local, the values driven, I feel like, you embody these values on our panel. Thank you for sharing everything you did. I know some of it was quite painful to talk about. And, I wanted to ask you, we talked when we spoke before the panel about offering recommendations and ideas for the students in the room. And I hope you don't mind me calling on you for this, but I think as a social entrepreneur, both in business and your nonprofit, that you're well placed to kind of share some of your philosophy and thoughts to those points. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, my opening statement, I touched on action. And I think that's one of the most important things I'm trying to take away from, everybody I've heard speak over these past few days is there's so much dialogue, but okay, now what, right? And I think, especially as the next leadership in this country, you have a lot of impact you could make. And I do think, to the points made up here, it has become a little bit more of a me culture, right? Everyone's on Instagram or taking selfies, and it becomes very much insular. But I think, the more that we do together to, even affect some change in your local communities can kind of have a ripple effect. So, it's not going to be pretty if you start to do something and the action might not be right, that you have to pivot to something else. But like my main takeaway that I hope you have from at least my part of the talk is that you have to start something. Like I started my foundation on strategic partnerships, as Kyle was mentioning too. Those are super important. And even though we're emerging, we've been able to influence a Nike or a Puma or a Burberry or these global clubs to do a little bit something. So, impact is not always perfect, but in increments you can build. So whatever it is that you're doing, whether I like to call people who work in business and entrepreneurs, where you can actually make a change in any kind of business that you are employed in. If you become an entrepreneur, what other things can you do within your business practice to make change and inspire others to make change, or drag them along if you need to. But for my particular instance in both the foundation and the for-profit fashion business is that we've taken the approach of really, really good content, really, really good design. And then the reason to believe in both of those entities is actually, the impact that we're making and the human rights work that we're doing. A Burberry, I don't think as a luxury heritage brand has ever worked with an emerging brand. And now they're donating unused fabrics to us to use in our collection. So it's like a win-win where we're taking care of a problem where they're not using fabrics and we get to use that fabric. And then we get access to these high quality, luxury quality fabrics to use. And we're using what the earth already has on it so that we're not having to grow organic cotton and use a ton of water towards that. So, the more that we could work together collectively, but also just take the action just to start, whether you're in a business, at school, building your own thing, that's the most important thing.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to open it up to questions now because I'm sure you've got lots of questions to ask these wonderful panelists. Erica's going to take it from here in terms of moderating these questions. So
I'm simply going to assist, and let's go in the back here, third row on the right-hand side.
Hi, thank you guys so much for the great panel. My question is related to NIL and how that's kind of changing the game in higher education and the business world for sports, and even in terms of recruiting, on how athletes are looking at different institutions for NIL deals and how that might impact where they decide to attend.
Thank you. So that might well be a question for Kyle, I'm going to say. And I think everyone knows NIL, name, image, and likeness. But yes, over to you, Kyle.
Sure. Thank you. It 100% has changed everything about the way that that coaches are building programs, that institutions are resourcing their programs within the athletic department, the way in which we're running our bookstore, the way in which we're running our merchandise partnerships, the way in which we're approaching corporate partners. Now, in a lot of instances, I think in the merchandise space, we've been able to layer it into the business that we have, and student athletes are able to participate in a way that allows them to tie their families in. It allows us to tie the different brands in. There's much less pressure on the merchandise side of things because it's a passive type of income. It's easy for all student athletes to participate. Last year, the University of Connecticut was the #1 school in the country in sales and royalties collected in NIL products. Might have had a little to do with Paige Beckers, but we're tracking, and we 100% have the most student athletes around the country participating in NIL activities. Our athletics department has embraced it. As I touched on earlier, the pressure on our institution to generate revenue is greater than it's ever been, in part because now our athletics department is sharing revenue with the student athletes. But that's also putting pressure on our corporate partners or potential corporate partners. Much more difficult now to generate the type of value that you might want to, and you might have been able to historically from a corporate partnership directly with the institution, because now they see the student athlete as the vehicle for that particular partnership. So if hypothetically a partnership with Coca-Cola were valued at $500,000 a year for the athletics department, but now we would like Coca-Cola to do an NIL deal with multiple student athletes, are they going to take that from the $500,000, or is it going to be incremental? Or are you going to have corporate partners that come to the institution and say, we're interested in you because of this student athlete, but we want the association with the institution? Well, if we value that partnership at $500,000, but they've already committed that money to the student athlete, and they'd simply like to layer in the use of marks, it's really made it, again, I think, more necessary than ever for people in my role and in other roles around institutions around the country to just say, yes, let's figure out a way to get it done. It always used to start with, here's the entry point. And now the entry point is you've made the contact, and now we have to work out a way to try to make it work, because at the end of the day, I think tying back into the other part of your question, it 100% is about being attractive to potential student athletes to come to your institution. So our coaches can say that we generated more revenue for NIL than any other school in the country. And I can have a conversation with a company that is going to be creating a college basketball video game and say, my student athletes here at UConn should get paid more than the other student athletes. That it isn't a fair market because we're the basketball capital of the world and it's a college basketball video game and they need us to be in it. So, there's those types of things that I think, but it has literally added an industry to our already existing industry. And it's incredibly challenging, and the challenge is different every day because it means something different to every single student athlete.
If I just wanted to say, in terms of talking about business and sport and human rights, that's a really interesting case study about how taking a human rights-based approach can let you be proactive and constructive. So, my understanding in the emergence of the NIL system now is it's very chaotic and it's leaving a lot of people behind. As much as there are definitely some winners, it hasn't resolved the problems for everyone. And it is a result of a Supreme Court decision, right? There were judgments that found the previous system was not in compliance. It wasn't, following basic rights for the individuals affected. And if the commercial operators, if the regulators had looked at these problems proactively, then they may have been able to apply a system that would have had a broader, safety net for more athletes, because we do want more athletes protected, not just some.
Thanks so much.
We've got a question right here in the brown.
If you want to just give us your name, and if you're directing your question to one of the panelists, then obviously feel free to let us know who it is. And if it's to all of them, then let us know that as well. So thank you.
Hi, my name is Swayam. Thank you for the insights today. The question is open for the entire panel. I just want to know, what is your opinion on the impact that corporate social responsibility would have on today's theme of business, sports, and human rights?
I'll start taking that. Well, I think at least where my starting point is that, business and human rights is kind of the concept that is already going even further than just corporate social responsibility. And, this whole idea of even seeing in different countries legislative initiatives, so lawmaking around what should businesses do and what should they report on and all of that, I think is, already going a bit further than that. And then bringing that to sport is, that's, I think, where we need to keep doing our work and helping not just the commercial actors in sports, but also all the other actors that are involved in this sport ecosystem. Take this CSR approach, take the business and human rights approach, take a human rights-based approach serious, because in the end, they all kind of say the same thing. They all include principles like participation. They all include principles like accountability, non-discrimination. So I think, I know that CSR is something that maybe some sport bodies have, started to think about more and way sooner than going into, the UNGPs. But I do believe that there's, really much more to get out of this human rights due diligence process and following those steps. In the end, though, and I think that's also something important we all need to realize, and I realized in my work with a range of sport bodies, we also need to be careful with how we phrase this and what kind of words we use. Coming to sports bodies with this, like, you need to do human rights, you need to do CSR is often not very productive in what you want to achieve. And I think we also need to get better maybe at acknowledging the CSR work, the human rights work that a lot of sports are doing without labeling it human rights, without calling it human rights, right? And then I think what it is about is focusing on the outcomes. What do we really want to see happening? What do we see? What do we want to get? Who do we want to get better? Who do we want to be put in a better position? And think about, how we address that with what kind of concepts and phrases and semantics and all of that. So I think it's always a bit kind of double how we use these concepts in our work. I don't know if that answered your question, to be honest, but maybe someone else wants to come in.
I would just add, from what I see live time from, the sport businesses that I work with in collaboration, and also even to an extent the pro clubs, is that everybody kind of has that ESG kind of social strategy embedded, but some do better than others. And also, they're looking for ways to do that authentically within their community. So that's what we get a lot of. They're a way that we could really do responsibility or do something responsible. But I will also say that everybody in this room has so much power, because when consumers and fans actually demand that of the companies and the clubs, that's when they move to action. Because I hate to say it, but it's, a capitalist like system, so that, when it's bottom dollar driven, companies and businesses will pay way more attention. So everybody in this room has that power to use your voice and use your spending dollars to impact how seriously these businesses address social corporate responsibility.
I just want to, because I was going to make a similar point to that. I think, we talk about this in classes on campus a lot. The cost of social responsibility is going to be borne by the consumer. And so, when students ask, well, if there's so much risk in being in 48 countries around the world in 3,500 different factories, why don't we just make everything in the United States? Or why don't we just make things in a safer place in the world? And the answer to that is cost. The fact that student athletes are being shared revenue now is going to make college sports more expensive. So athletes are being treated more fairly. There's no argument about that. They're getting a piece of pie they absolutely deserve, but the cost is going to be borne by you, the fan. And the same thing in the bookstore. If we want a sweatshirt made by a worker who got paid a living wage as opposed to a fair wage or a minimum wage, a living wage, are you willing to pay $225 for a hooded sweatshirt? Because that's what it will cost. I'm not saying that's what it does cost. I'm saying that's what it will cost, right? And so those are, yes, we all want to be beyond socially responsible, but ultimately, as Suzanne said, that is in your hands 100% as the consumer of everything sport related, to make that decision.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what you said, Suzanne, about the level of seriousness of organizations or businesses engaging with CSR or ESG. I mean, I've worked with sport bodies that say, "Oh, but we are socially responsible. We have our, we follow these ESG principles. So we do business human rights because." Last year, when we were at the World Cup, we visited the favelas, and we also, we went to the worker camps. So we are doing that. I mean, that's ridiculous, to hear that. But I think then it is our responsibility indeed to hold them to account to when they say one thing, that's the actions mean way more. But it's also our responsibility to help them learn that this is not what it's about. This is not what it means. And to I think, everybody always has a role to play in the whole ecosystem. You need the advocates. You need also those people that work together with sports bodies and work trying to get that change from within. So just wanted to pick up on that point.
Thanks. In the back row.
So my name is Brian Sheriffs, and this question's for the panel. Just out of curiosity, from a multitude of different perspectives, I'd be curious from y'all's perspective, since the inception of NIL and how the landscape has really transformed. How many athletes would you say, percentage-wise, are the decision makers of their affairs?
I've had a really interesting experience, not only with pro players, but college as well, including UConn. Shout out UConn, women's soccer. But we always have the most success on the able-made side, actually, frankly, on the foundation side, when it's the athlete being empowered to get to know us or have an intro conversation versus any agent or manager. That hands down slows down the process. And Brooklyn FC's, their captain, actually has something called the Players Network, where it's an amazing organization where they're educating the pro players within that network. It's awesome. You guys should check it out for any college athletes in the room. But I always find that our deals happen first when we go through the athlete, and whether or not that person is super educated, and then they bring their agent or manager into the conversation is when the actual action takes place. Even with this top WNBA player who just joined our investor cap table. I met her at a game, and then she actually pulled in her agent and her manager into the conversation, and it happened really fast. It all happened fast, but because she was driving it versus me having to call up their agency and waiting for a month to get a reply. So I think the more that the athletes are empowered and educated about the opportunities they might have in front of them, is where we're seeing both on the college level and the pro level.
Do you want to add something, Ginous?
I just want to say, I think that's a great research question. I think, someone needs to be writing that paper because that data would really help with probably informing how to design the system around it so that the most amount of athletes are being uplifted. I think this idea of, a rising tide lifts all boats, that's sometimes the case, but sometimes in a really competitive, high performance market, there can be really vast extremes between winners and losers. And so that is a major concern. And that's why historically unions have been so important, because you take the workforce and you build solidarity among them, right? They have a collective mentality where they understand, the better you do, the better I do. And I think in a system that starts to really drive and incentivize this individual, market segmentation, then you start to really risk a little bit of a race to the bottom along with the race to the top. So please write that paper.
Yeah, I think you hit on it referencing unions. I think in professional sports leagues, the athletes are, they certainly can represent themselves, but if they're being represented, they have to be represented by certified sport agents. And, and I think that in the haste to institute NIL in college athletics, there's been obviously a complete and utter lack of regulation, right? What's the phrase? We're building the plane as we're flying it. That's never successful. And so I think I have, fantastic relationships with many representatives of student athletes on this campus. And we've done some really, really good things that have gotten into market, whether that's with corporate partners or with merchandise collaborations. And we've had equally terrible ones, right? So, because for every student athlete whose agent wants them to work with a reputable merchandise partner, there's another one who has an uncle down the road who has a t-shirt company, right? And so, I think there's always going to be challenges in that. And I think what my hope, sort of piggyback on your question, is what I think that UConn and all institutions should be doing is requiring their student athletes to participate in NIL. We have 450 to 500 students that are actively participating. That leaves several hundred that are not. I think the university should make it a 3-credit course. I think the student athletes could learn about business and marketing and agents and contracts and all of the different things. They could learn about human rights. They could learn about the supply chain that is being impacted. So, again, everything's an educational opportunity at the college level. And this particular piece of it is no different.
Another question.
Let's go in the center here. Yes, thank you.
Hello? Oh, okay, it's working.
Hi.
I really have a question for Daniela, as she works in human rights. How does human rights help the younger generation participate in sports without jeopardizing their safety and risking corruption for younger generation and people entering college sports or professional sports?
That's a great question. I think that could be for others as well. But should we start with you, Daniela?
Sure.
Since it was addressed to you.
Yeah, please, others come in. I think, like I said, I just want to be mindful of, not saying things or not pretending to be talking about things I can't talk about. So I'm not very familiar with college sports systems. As I'm based in the Netherlands, I'm from Germany, and so I grew up in that system way more. And in my work and in my research, I, focused, on just understanding the experience of young athletes entering sports, different kind of sports in different, countries around the world, and just seeing what kind of, opportunities and good it brings to them, but then focusing on the harm that can address or that can come. And here I've been involved in a couple of projects we use the word safeguarding. I don't know what the term you use here, safe sport, maybe is a bit more familiar. But basically, this idea of that there can be, emotional, physical, sexual abuse happening in sports because of the different power dynamics that you have in sports with, the coaches, the other officials from a club, from a federation, versus the young athletes that, just want to go there to get better and have a certain dream. And we heard all about that yesterday as well. And, the precarious situation that brings with it. And what we see happening now in that whole safeguarding space is that it certainly is I think, more advanced topic with some sport bodies than this whole human rights and business human rights approach. The IOC has been very active in trying to establish regional hubs, and also recognizing that some of that is quite also embedded in local context. So you can't have one central approach to making sure that the sporting environments are safe everywhere, because there are just different kind of risks and challenges depending on what sport it is and where that sport takes place. So just, taking that more local approach to safeguarding and keeping kids safe that are trying to, be athletes and learn all the good things and opportunities that come with sports. Not sure if that maybe gives you a bit of an answer, but
Thank
Ginous,
you.
maybe you want to add?
So I really loved that question. I wanted to also say Dr. Heerdt is being a bit humble because she has been part of something called the Hero Project, which did a deep dive specifically into athlete perceptions about their human rights, their awareness, their capacities to be able to, claim those rights. And it's something that I hope, expands beyond where it's, I think, currently more available in Europe, and it's, spread to other continents and countries too, especially in the U.S. You're asking about it from, I think, the perspective of both how athletes themselves can, do something, can act. And I think Daniela answered that really well. But there's also the element of expect that from the sports bodies. Expect it from your coach. Expect it from your parents. Expect it from, your university or your professional team. And just, don't let them off the hook that they actually have, responsibilities towards you as an athlete. They are supposed to, treat you a certain way. And sometimes the label of athlete is actually a big barrier to being able to claim your rights, because in the sport context, who gets to define what an athlete is and what they're supposed to do, how they should act, how they should be? It's not usually the athlete themselves. They have to follow rules that are written by other people. And there's, in a sense, another rule book for human rights. And that rule book is set at the international level by these treaties that states have signed. And they have the duty and obligation to guarantee those rights for you. But if the sports bodies don't understand those, and if they think, well, when they're on the field, we get to decide what their rights are. And many of these rights are called non-derogable. You can't actually ever renounce specific rights. And so when there's a conflict, a clash between those two rule books, then there's one that supersedes the other. And so, you have to kind of know those rights. Research shows many athletes know their rights. It's that they don't really think they can change the system to be able to experience those rights. And that's the part that has to change.
On that note, I know there were more questions that we haven't got to. Please do come up, speak to us either at the end of the panel or during lunch, but we do need to close now. And so I wanted to thank each and every one of you for your contributions. That was a fascinating discussion.
And just a quick announcement. All are welcome to join us in the courtyard for lunch immediately following this session. Please do come back at 1 p.m. for our final panel of the summit, Sport and Human Rights Close to Home, featuring our alumni student athletes. So please be sure to join us for that.